Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this important conversation. My name is Sorelle Friedler, and I'm thrilled to be here representing the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. OSTP is the team charged with advising the President on issues of science and technology. We work with agencies and departments across the U.S. government, making sure that every American can take advantage of groundbreaking research, new discoveries, and critical innovation, from our health and environmental quality to our security and shared prosperity. In this session, we'll be focusing on the technologies that touch every part of our daily life. These tools have great potential to make life easier and fairer for individuals and communities. At the same time, we're seeing what can happen when powerful new technologies go unchecked, with a growing body of evidence showing that the harms of AI and data-driven tools often fall unfairly on vulnerable and historically excluded communities. President Biden has summed it up well. This could be a moment marked by peril, or we can make it a moment of promise and possibility. That's why the administration is fighting to get development right, to ensure new technologies are rooted in our common values: equality, accountability, justice, and integrity. We need a roadmap, a set of democratic principles to ensure that all Americans can share in the benefits of innovation. Today's event is one session in a multi-part series to engage the American public in the process of developing that roadmap and ultimately creating a Bill of Rights for an automated society. Over the coming months, we're bringing together experts, practitioners, advocates, and government officials to discuss the risks, harms, benefits, and policy opportunities of automated technologies, and we're amplifying the voices of communities in the process. In addition to participating in this series, there are several ways for the public to weigh in. You can email us about how artificial intelligence has made an impact in your life, take part in a listening session about your experience with biometric technologies, or respond to our request for information by January 15th. With that, I'll hand things over to our host for today, the Mozilla Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sorelle. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jay Babalota, Vice President of Global Programs at Mozilla Foundation, and I'm joined by Navrita Singh, Mozilla Foundation board member and founder of Credo AI, a company focused on governing, auditing, and managing risks of artificial intelligence. Mozilla is honored and excited to co-host this vital conversation today alongside the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Navrita and I are so pleased to be here with a moderator and panelists that I surely can say I deeply admire. We're so pleased that those of you watching decided to join us as well. Our panel today is titled AI and Democratic Values. We'll be discussing one of the most pressing issues at the intersection of technology and society. How can we build a world where powerful tech like artificial intelligence harmonizes with democracy? Trustworthy AI is an issue Mozilla Foundation cares deeply about. We're excited to see the White House taking the lead on this issue, and we're certainly signed up to do everything we can to help. We hope you are too. Now, some context. We, whether within the United States, the US government, people in every other country, we're sprinting into the next phase of computing, and that's AI. Every day, we produce untold amounts of data, from where we drive, to what we listen to what we buy. And that data is used to train sophisticated AI systems that make decisions about us and for us. Sometimes these decisions are banal, like what song we listen to next. Other times, these decisions are incredibly impactful, like whether or not we qualify for a home loan or receive an accurate cancer diagnosis. Automated decisions are also playing a role in our democracy. Recommendation algorithms and news feeds can determine what election news we read, and law enforcement and government agencies can use facial recognition AI to surveil us. These technologies are embedded in our phones, our smart speakers, and the digital machinery of government. And just like the analog systems that predated them, they can be flawed, sometimes deeply flawed. When these systems aren't designed responsibly, or if they're trained by bad data, real people suffer. Election misinformation is amplified to millions, or facial recognition AI misidentifies Black and brown faces. And often it's those of us who bear the brunt of analog disparities who also suffer most in the algorithmically materialized world. This became crystal clear over the past couple of months by way of whistleblower Frances Haugen and the Facebook papers. Haugen argued that when Facebook relaxed its election safeguards too soon after the 2020 election, it fueled misinformation and the eventual Capitol riots. It's a tragic story, but also one that perfectly encapsulates the moment we're in. We do need whistleblowers, but we also need more. Navrina, what else do we need?
Thank you, Bob. What we need is to develop whole new approaches to artificial intelligence accountability and safety, just like we did with the auto industry 50 years ago. We need to determine what basic protections Americans have in a world which is rife with these AI systems. We need to build a field of professionals that dedicate their careers to ethical AI. And we need to shift the norms of the tech industry to ensure that equity, privacy, and safety are top of mind as products are developed. That's the focus of today's conversation. And what we will discuss over the next 75 minutes will contribute to something tangible and essential, a Bill of Rights for our automated society. The issues we unpack today now will guide the OSTP as they draft a new actionable charter for Americans in our increasingly automated world. Personally, I have spent the last 2 years building a startup making ethical AI a reality at scale. And we've seen this firsthand, the struggle that organizations are facing in governing the AI they're already deploying today. Efforts like the Bill of Rights can play a critical role in helping organizations understand what good looks like in an AI and offering direction on how to build and govern AI systems that serve humanity. Again, on behalf of Mozilla Board of Directors, Mozilla is honored to be part of this discussion and to contribute to this Bill of Rights. Like our friends at the OSTP, Mozilla is striving for a world where AI systems help us rather than harm us, where privacy, transparency, and human well-being are fundamental principles, and where government and companies are held accountable if they violate those principles. That's why Mozilla has dedicated $25 million each year in programs to advance this cause. So once again, thank you so much for joining us. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Kathy Pham, the Deputy Chief Technology Officer for Product and Engineering at the Federal Trade Commission and a former Mozilla Fellow. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you. Thank you, Navrina. Thank you, Jay Bob. Thank you, Sorel, for setting us up. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for spending time with us today online and joining wherever you are. So before we start, let's start with the most basic question that others have already actually brought up. Why are we here? What's the point of having this discussion? We're here because some of these issues that we're addressing have gone too long unaddressed, and it's time for us to really work together to articulate some of the rules for the road. So what is a democratic vision for our automated society? And as Sorel mentioned in their introduction, it's time to situate technology development in some of our values of equity, accountability, justice, integrity. And how do we make this a reality? How do we make this real in practice? We can only do it by partnering with a wide range of stakeholders, those who are affected, most particularly the American people and all who are affected by our technologies, as well as really bringing together a breadth of disciplines and understanding of how technology interacts with society. So today, we want to focus on the technical aspects of the work while also bringing in some of the social aspects as well, examining what it will take not just to come up with ideas for more equitable AI, artificial intelligence, but to actually design tech in ways that are non-discriminatory, that are explainable, that emphasize community participation, that prioritize privacy and beyond. We're really thrilled. I know I'm thrilled and honored to really just have a panel that features such a wide variety of perspectives, the technical experts, the world leaders who will help us explore what it'll take to achieve a design process that considers democratic values from the beginning, that really rethinks our engineering and product processes, and not just when issues emerge downstream, right? How do we plan for this? We want to get into the nitty-gritty. What kinds of technical expertise do we prioritize? What kind of teams do we build? What kinds of technical features are a must? How do we create incentives to promote the right design decisions? We'll get into all of that over the course of this next hour or so. And as a reminder, we're taking Q&A on Twitter at Mozilla, and you should see that handle as well, with the hashtag Democratic AI, and we'll start taking audience and public questions around 11:50 Eastern time. So with that, I will go ahead and introduce the panelists, and then get to a series of questions for all of them. Really, we're in for such a treat today with these experts in the room. We have Liz O'Sullivan, CEO of Parity AI, Timney Kabru, an independent scholar, Jennifer Wortman-Vaughn, Senior Principal Researcher at Microsoft Research New York City, Pamela Wisniewski, Associate Professor of Computer Science at the University of Central Florida and Director of the Social Technical Interaction Research Lab, and Zenny Kamara, Associate Professor of Computer Science at Brown University and teaches algorithms for the people, which I know I've referenced quite often as well. So thank you so much for you all for being here with us and sharing so many of your insights. So kick it off with you, Ms. O'Sullivan. In light of the recent revelations indicating lack of transparency on tech platforms, there are continuing questions about whether the tech industry can be a trusted partner in pursuit of rights and value preserving tech. You lead a company devoted to designing the tools needed for building trustworthy AI, artificial intelligence systems. What does a positive vision for AI system production look like to you?
Thank you, Kathy. Very excited to be here. In this day and age, it is really such a cliche to say that technology has the potential to do much good in the world, and especially around artificial intelligence. We've all seen the headlines, AI is going to change the world. But I still say this very often because I really do believe it. Tech can do a lot of good. It historically has been very useful in increasing our access to vital resources, improving quality of life, and even extending the longevity of humans on this planet. Some of the most interesting stuff that's happening in AI right now is happening in medicine, helping us understand our bodies, our cellular structures, and a lot of this analysis would simply not be possible without the complexity and power of AI. And the trouble is, as so many of you have said, it does also have the ability to worsen existing inequalities, and we're already seeing that. AI surveillance is being disproportionately deployed against Black and Brown communities, and limited resources in healthcare are going doubly to healthy white patients when Black and Brown ones need them more. And all of this is made worse by the fact that the people creating this software are so often homogenous in terms of race, gender, socioeconomic status, and political beliefs. This homogeneity is not just a small problem because it leads to underrepresentation in data sets and poor problem formulation that results in faulty, error-prone software that discriminates against the communities who need our help the most. And we simply cannot let this happen. What people often forget is that AI is a conservative technology in the clinical sense, meaning that it can only take what it has seen and replicate it. In its current form, artificial intelligence is really a misnomer. There's no intelligence there. It has no imagination, no ingenuity, no ability to invent. Instead, it is merely a representation of the views and values of the people who are creating it. And as such, a positive vision of AI must therefore be inclusive of diverse and even adversarial perspectives. We must be empowered to challenge the status quo, and simply can't be done within one company where everybody seated on a similar team is subject to the same profit-driven KPIs. And in fact, we have to make sure that we don't let the pursuit of profit drive the field forward unchecked, nor can we allow it to be driven by the military-industrial complex and the global pursuit of power at the expense of our rivals and civilians all over the world. As it stands, as Meredith Whittaker loves to say, and she's completely correct in saying that only a few firms on Earth currently have the capabilities to produce AI at scale because of their unique access to compute and data. But these companies also have the money and power to cover up their failures while shouting successes from the rooftops, creating an inflated image in the minds of the public and regulators of what AI can and cannot do. And so a positive view requires the ability to dissent and to challenge these big firms, one where critical research is welcomed instead of silenced or expelled. Because without advance notice of what AI can do or how it could fail, the public becomes the unwitting, involuntary test subjects of this technology, with real consequences on their ability to find work, a place to live, or even access medical care. And so, at the risk of sounding like yet another toothless set of AI principles, I'd like to offer a few ideas of what we might need just to create the bare minimum of a framework that can allow us to enjoy the benefits of artificial intelligence while minimizing its potential for harm. First and foremost, we need to know that AI is being used on us. We need to have recourse to meaningfully challenge its decision-making. We need to have the ability to opt out of this algorithmic judging entirely and to have a say in how our personal data is used to create the models. This is a world where we've sought input from diverse stakeholders and civil society, and we have a guarantee that this technology has been tested on more than just the minimum of protected classes that are currently shielded by civil rights law. And we need this world to be enforced proactively by regulators such that AI is never allowed to do things that are out of line with what the public believes AI should and should not be able to do. Don't get me wrong, technology has a major role to play in the policing of this technology and the governance of its introduction into the world. But I'm very skeptical of any technologies that claim to be ethics in a box, or in a software library, or an enterprise platform, or whatever the case may be. Because real solutions to this problem will be social in nature, cutting through boring business processes, ensuring participation outside of company payroll, with guidance from civil society, and with meaningful input from the people subject to the decisions that these machines churn out. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that vision on what AI systems can look like and really bringing in the social issues and civil society and meaningful input as well, which sets us up for Professor Wisniewski and thinking about value-sensitive design. So back in 1996, Batya Friedman wrote about the need for value-sensitive design. In 2021, do you think that human-computer interaction research and education is equipped to take on the challenge of designing AI tech that is sensitive to democratic values? And if so, can you highlight some examples? And if not, how can we nudge the field in the right direction?
That's a really great question. And to answer it, first, we need to unpack the idea behind value-sensitive design. So Batya and her colleagues identified the need to proactively and systematically account for human values in the design of new technologies. So value-sensitive design acknowledges that there are often value tensions between the different stakeholders of the system, so that those tensions need to be balanced in a principled and thoughtful way. Therefore, value-sensitive design can definitely be applied to the design of AI systems. Sorry, I just was reading the message there. For instance, our team is developing human-centered algorithms to proactively detect cyberbullying and sexual predation risks that youth encounter on social media. However, instead of using these algorithms to police what youth are doing online, our goal is to empower them by providing just-in-time resources and guidance on how to safely navigate these situations. That's because we as a team work directly with parents and teens. We value resilience and strength-based approaches to online safety over more restrictive and abstinence-based approaches to keeping teens safe online. So applying the concept of value-sensitive design to the challenge of designing AI systems that are sensitive to democratic values first requires us to ask the question, what are democratic values and to whom? So I have to admit that I had to Google the term democratic values when preparing for this panel because it's such a loaded term. So here's what the internet has to say about democracy. The core tenet of democracy, dating back to ancient Greece, is the rule of the people over the rule of the elite. Therefore, core values of democracy include freedom of speech, equality, majority rule, and taking into account the rights of the minority. So let's think about how AI does when accounting for these democratic values. To some extent, AI can amplify the voices of people over the elite when algorithms are trained based on representative and diverse data sets. AI could therefore potentially help identify majority rule in a way that supports democracy. Yet, this is where the question to whom also becomes increasingly important. Democracy in the United States means something different than it does in other countries. As a global nation, the values and social norms upheld in our country may inadvertently inhibit the freedoms, beliefs, and values of other countries. Unfortunately, AI could do a great job of propagating mistakes of our past, rather than identifying and correcting the injustices to make for a better future. When AI systems are trained using implicit biased, racist, misogynist, or otherwise problematic data sources, they then become a threat to democracy and the rights of the minorities. For example, we know that our justice system has historically been biased against people of color. Therefore, leveraging this historical data and taking into account race to predict the likelihood of future reoffense and length of sentences is simply immoral. Just because AI systems are based on large data sets and computational calculations, many people assume that AI is more objective than humans, who are sometimes irrational or emotional. AI systems rely on the concept of ground truth, which is generally a binary classification of fact that is based on someone's subjective opinion of what's true. This is great when the problem is fairly straightforward and low risk, such as a CAPTCHA that asks you if it contains an image of a crosswalk. Yet in more nuanced problems, like detecting the risk of violence based on a user saying, "I'm going to kill you," on a multiplayer war game, humans are still far better at assessing context, using their intuition and empathy to make value-based decisions. The ways in which we deploy AI systems also affects democracy. For instance, if AI is used to heavily moderate user-generated content online in an attempt to combat the spread of misinformation, it could potentially inhibit freedom of speech. If AI systems push people to fringe and extremist communities rather than bringing them together to find common ground, then it will also undermine democracy. If AI systems become the elite and replace the role of the people, then democracy has failed. So to answer your question, yes, I do believe that an education in human-centered computing and value-sensitive design is the only way that we as a global community can begin to design and deploy AI systems that uphold the principles of democracy. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Wisniewski, and having us think about HCI and HCC and human value-sensitive design, and also the question of for whom, which also now sets us up for Professor Kamara and a question about thinking about different communities as well. So in your highly acclaimed Crypto 2020 keynote, you called for a reframing of the very language and problems of cryptography to be more attuned to the needs of marginalized communities. What has been the reaction of the community, and where do you see room for optimism? And how would you recommend applying this focus to support the design of privacy-preserving technology?
Yeah, so I guess I'd say overall, I think the response has been better than expected, I'd say. So for context, the talk was a critique of my field, which is cryptography, but also of computer science as a whole. My sense is my field is very techno-optimist and somewhat defensive. So to be honest, when I went into it, I expected a lot of pushback and, a lot of, some backlash. But the talk was basically born out of, like a decade of frustration with my own field. So that's why I gave the talk. I think what did surprise me was the large number of PhD students that got in touch with me, in particular, to thank me for expressing things that they had been thinking about, but that they never got the chance to articulate. So that was, where a lot of my optimism sort of came from, right? I felt like that was a pretty good sign. And I met with a lot of those students just to hear kind of what their thoughts were and what they were thinking. And a lot of them were really, very excited about trying to change the field to be more inclusive. So what also surprised me, however, is that there seemed to be a lot of confusion about how to do socially responsible research and how to build socially responsible technology. And to my mind, it's kind of an indictment of our field, because even for folks who want to do this work, they have no idea where to begin. And I think that, that sort of shows our lack of leadership in some sense, since people don't even know how to do this, right? Like, you would imagine that we would be training people to design this kind of technology from the outset. So that's where maybe the less optimistic part came in. So with respect to the second part of your question, so in security and privacy, we talk about threat models, and this is really important. It's basically a description of who or what may harm you. And this is very important to keep in mind when you're designing privacy-enhancing technologies, right? You have to know exactly who you're designing against. And part of the critique in the talk was that different people have different threat models, and oftentimes the threat models, especially of marginalized communities, can be very unintuitive, right, to the mainstream technology industry. And so one of the things that I was asking for is that we become more conscious and more attuned to the particular threat models of different groups. And so, for example, like as a Black male living in New York City, my threat model may include the police, right? Which may not be the case if I'm living in a different part of the country, or if I'm from a different demographic group, right? And so we need to sort of pay attention to this, and we need to design technologies that takes this into account. And so, that is something that, me and my students and colleagues are really trying to, to push in our own community, right? What are the threat models? What are different people's threat models? And how do we design technology that takes that into account? So, I think we have a lot of work to do, but, I'm excited about actually trying to get it done. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing a bit about different threat models, and also just the insights you have from teaching students on their questions just about how to even do socially responsible research and socially responsible tech as well. And Dr. Gabru, you have called for the algorithmic accountability via various forms of audits, both from within companies and via external stakeholders. You've also worked to assess the discriminatory impact of live systems. Do you see audits as a best path forward in protecting marginalized communities from the harms of these systems? And really, what, in your view, are important next steps for governance in this area?
Yes, I see audits as one path, an important path. I wouldn't, I would caution against saying they're the, holy grail kind of thing. But I'm going to remove my self view because it's very difficult to talk and watch myself. So now I'm only seeing you, so I can continue. So what I've been thinking about, listening to everybody else who I learn from very much, and I was just jotting down notes of what I think about this, is that given that technology is about, it's a human endeavor, right? It's about people. And every time we do these audits, something that has been evergreen for me. And it's been that these companies have just come down really, really hard, right? So I got fired last year for writing about, for doing two things really, from Google, for writing about the harms of certain technologies and for talking about discrimination in the workplace. So if we want people to do these audits, if we want to empower people, whether it's technologists or impacted communities or anybody else, to do these audits, we have to have protections in place, right? And so these labor protections, the Silence No More Act that was just passed thanks to IFIOMA, the PRO Act that we're, hopefully will be passed. These to me are 100% important. I know it might seem different, that the labor kind of protections conversation might seem different from the, Bill of Rights, the AI Bill of Rights kind of conversation. But to me, they go hand in hand, because you see that it's always impacted communities who audit these systems, and they have to fight to be heard, right? But if they don't have these labor protections, they're doubly impacted. You do all the work to uncover all of these issues, and then you again have a second set of issues because you are retaliated against. So that's one for me. The second thing I would say is, it's always victims who are it's kind of like one set of people has a playground and they can do whatever they want. They can create toys and they don't have to think about the harms that they're causing in the world. They're just thinking about their imagination, and then they get $1 billion to work on it, and then they do it. And then another set of people is always saying, oh my God, what are you doing? And always fighting for that. And so that set of people doesn't have the chance to work on their imagination, get $1 billion, you know? So in addition to, I think, auditing, it's really important to invest in people from impacted groups in their future. So the value sensitive design, right? And their imagination of what the future is, what technology is. Just to give you one example right now, I'm looking at the time. I don't even, that's what I'm trying to do with an independent research institute. But currently, I haven't been doing that because I went from one fire to another. Now I'm analyzing the issue, the role of social media in a horrible conflict in Ethiopia, which is where I was born and raised. And there were calls for genocide that went unabated. Even when we reported them to Facebook and initially said that it didn't violate their policies. Only after uproar, after reporters were calling them, did they take it down, right? And this is just one post. And they talked about how, when Facebook talks about what they're doing better, they talk about how they started support in 3 or 4 languages in Ethiopia, right? Which means that they were operating in the country without that support in the first place. And so for me, I'm thinking, how is this legal? How is it legal for a company to be able to do this? Right. So I think legally there should be things in place to hold them accountable too, because we're talking about democratic values. We're seeing research after research on the impacts of these social media platforms on democracy. So again, I guess I didn't necessarily answer the question in terms of audits, but when you say audits, I'm thinking protections. The other example is the researchers at NYU who, we're trying to audit Facebook's platform, right? And then they no longer have access. So they need to be protected. So yes, audits are very important, but in order for audits to happen, the auditors need to be protected, the impacted communities need to be protected, but also impacted communities need to be able to have their vision of the future and not just always be behind auditing the systems that are impacting them negatively.
Thank you so much for sharing that insight and taking it so far beyond just auditing and talking about how do we invest in those groups who are most impacted, and in a way where you don't just design with them, but how do we bring people in to be the designer in the playground, in the sandbox, and also the roles of law and policy as well. Thank you so much for sharing so many of those insights. And over to you, Dr. Wortman-Vaughan. In your recent work, you have focused on human-computer interaction approach to assessing explainability systems. How far do you believe the research community is from being able to generate explanations in live, high-stakes settings that will provide meaningful explanations to impacted communities?
Thanks so much for the question, Kathy, and thanks so much for having me today. I'm excited to be part of this conversation. So I take the viewpoint in my work that people are at the heart of machine learning. People are defining the tasks that we use machine learning to solve. People build and evaluate the models, they generate the data, and ultimately are the ones who are impacted by these systems. As Timnit said, technology is a human endeavor. So because of this, building machine learning systems that are reliable, trustworthy, and fair requires relevant stakeholders to have at least a basic understanding of how they work. But there are big barriers still to achieving meaningful notions of explainability or interpretability, as it's often called in the machine learning community. One is that there are no one-size-fits-all solutions in this space. So there's no ethics in a box, as Liz put it. There are different stakeholders who require interpretability. We've got data scientists, project managers, domain experts, decision makers, end users, people impacted by systems, regulators, and so on. All of them have different needs, right? So what's interpretable to a data scientist who has years of experience with machine learning is going to be very different from what's interpretable to a member of an impacted community who may not have a good sense of what AI even is. And I will say that most of the methods out there are really built by experts for experts. Needs for interpretability also depend on the context, on the domain, and on a stakeholder's goals. If you think about a lending scenario, for example, What I need to know about a model may be different if my goal is to change my own behavior to improve my chances of being given a loan, compared with if my goal is to contest a decision that was made. But with some exceptions, much of the work coming out of the machine learning community doesn't take into account these differences in needs and doesn't go the extra step of working with stakeholders to figure out what approach is right for them and test whether approaches to interpretability actually help meet people's goals. A second related barrier is that explanations don't always have the effect we want them to and can sometimes backfire. Just providing an explanation to a stakeholder doesn't mean that the stakeholder will be able to use the explanation effectively. In my own research, my collaborators and I have run user studies with lay people designed to test common intuitions about interpretability. Things like simple models are interpretable or transparency leads to better decisions. And among other things, we found that too much transparency about a model's internals can actually make people less likely to notice when the model's making a mistake. We have some evidence that in our particular study, this is due to information overload. As another example, my collaborators and I ran user studies exploring how data scientists understand and make use of the explanations that are provided by current interpretability tools. We found, among other things, that explanations can cause data scientists to overtrust a model, even when the explanation is highlighting problematic behavior of the model that should be making the data scientist more skeptical. This kind of thing has been observed in other research as well. The mere existence of an explanation can lead to overtrust, even when the explanation doesn't make sense. A third barrier that I want to mention is that for complex black box models like neural networks, explanations can never tell the whole story, and sometimes they'll be misleading or even wrong. There's no technical fix for this, right? If a model is sufficiently complicated, then just by definition, we can't sum up its behavior easily. Because of this, some researchers, including Cynthia Rudin and others, have been advocating for the use of glass box or simple transparent models in any truly high stakes settings when predictions are impacting people's lives. And I largely agree with this. There's this myth out there that there's an interpretability accuracy trade-off, but actually in many domains, particularly when we have tabular data, so not things like images or text, simple glass box models perform as well as complicated models like deep neural networks. So there's no reason to use something more complex. To end on a little bit of a positive note here, I do think that there is hope, but we need to view interpretability in a different way than we currently do. First, we need to stop relying on people's intuition about what makes a good explanation, and instead more heavily test empirically which factors of a model or explanation actually help stakeholders achieve their goals. Second, we should consider transparency or interpretability beyond a model itself. So maybe we want to think about interpretability of data or of objectives or of performance metrics. How do we make sure that end users understand notions like false positive rates or false negative rates? How do we help them understand what data was used to train a model and why that matters? In some cases, this may actually be more important than understanding why a model made a particular prediction. Finally, we should be designing and evaluating methods for achieving interpretability in context with relevant stakeholders. This requires interdisciplinary teams to do right, and it requires a lot of work because, again, there are not going to be one-size-fits-all solutions here. We need more and earlier interaction between machine learning researchers, HCI researchers, designers, and others. So also, more education in human-centered computing, as Pamela was mentioning earlier. And we need more participation from impacted communities as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wortman-Bond. And thank you for expanding so much of the understanding of how we think about interpretability, transparency, explainability, and what that means for different people as well. And I was thinking as you all were talking how lucky you were to have such deep technical expertise inside computer science and computing and engineering who are all interrogating and thinking about our fields very differently and bringing in community and different community voices and society in ways that historically we just haven't done before. So thank you so much to you all for bringing that into the conversation, into the core part of engineering and computer science, which, as you all know, it's quite a special thing that we're seeing, a trend that we're seeing change in our fields. So now for this portion, we'll dive into some generic questions for everyone, as well as audience questions. And since we are here with the Office of Science and Technology Policy, we'll kick off, and some of you have touched on this as well, we'll kick off with a question about policy. So in light of the various issues you all have discussed, and this is for all 5 of you, anyone who would like to chime in, what do you think are some of the policy needs in your area of concerns? And are there any policy interventions that may be promising to pursue? Feel free to unmute and share your thoughts.
That's the thing about these virtual panels, is nobody has the social cues to know when to go first. I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit about our recent published work. We published a framework of high stakes algorithmic decision-making in the public sector. This was based on an ethnographic case study of the US child welfare system. So in that paper, we urged policymakers to balance the trade-offs between bureaucracy, human discretion, and algorithmic decision-making. So what that means is that instead of using AI to make predictions and definitive decisions that affect the lives of people, these systems should be prescriptive in that they recommend potential actions that could be taken given the data in a way that augments human discretion to make well-informed decisions. The goal here was to continue to place our trust in people rather than technology, but to use technology in a way to help people do better. For example, a child welfare caseworker who has a long-term and close relationship with a child should have more say in the placement of that child than the output of a computer.
Thank you, Pamela. Any others would like to unmute and share some thoughts?
I can jump in. So I have a lot of thoughts here, but let me zoom in specifically on policy as it relates to transparency and explainability. So I first want to emphasize again just how crucial it is that, interventions in the space of explainability allow for flexibility in different approaches that can be used. I sound like a broken record at this point, but there really are just no one-size-fits-all approaches here, and we don't want policy to be so specific that it's really dictating what approaches are going to be used in different contexts. I do think that there's space for effective policy interventions around transparency, broadly speaking, and effectively for high-risk applications. So we might want transparency around the process behind how a model is created, right? Where's the training data coming from? This is something that we could require transparency on. Or transparency around the high-level behavior of a system. What are a system's capabilities? What are a system's limitations? What should the system not be used for? How should you measure accuracy of the system in your own context in a way that's relevant to you? This is actually an approach that Microsoft has been taking through our public transparency notes that accompany AI platforms. And it nicely complements as well the work that Tim Neat and others have done on model cards. Lastly, I'll mention that I think human oversight is also really important in these high-risk settings, but just throwing a human in the loop is not necessarily going to be helpful. And I'd say if we're going to try to regulate human oversight, we need a bigger emphasis on how exactly the human should be trained to interact with the system and how we can evaluate the effectiveness of this training.
Thank you, Dr. Wortman-Von. To Neat and Liz.
I guess because I have a lot of thoughts, but because I was going down this one path anyways, I'm gonna focus on that one path, which is I will go back to again labor protections because so yes, I agree on transparency. I agree on many other things. The thing is that there is a power dynamic, and if people don't think they're going to be held accountable, they keep on getting away with whatever they're doing, right? And so I think that these regulations on antitrust, on labor protection, on whistleblower protection are just key. And in fact, when we're seeing where all of this surveillance tech is usually used on people who have no agency, and refugees see all the smart border control, face recognition, biometrics, anything, you have it. The thing that's going to come to your door 10, 20 years from now, that's where they see it. And why? Because there's no protection. People can do whatever they want on you because you don't have the protection. So I think that, again, like labor protection, whistleblower protection, strengthening these agencies, these anti-discrimination, EOC, all of these agencies is really important in my view.
Yes, first of all, completely agree with everything that's been said so far. And I've already spent a lot of time talking about the need for opt-out, the need to have the right to challenge these decisions in a sophisticated way. But I'm going to mention something that's maybe a little bit more inside baseball and wonky as it applies to industry, because far too often we hear people say, oh, the right to not be discriminated against already exists. And that's true. But if you don't know that you're discriminating against a particular group or an intersectional group within these overarching protected classes, then you can't actually do anything about it to stop it or to remedy it. And so in some cases, especially in the financial industry, but in others as well, there are laws that prevent these companies from collecting demographic labels. So we won't have the ability to know if somebody has a disability or is of a certain protected class like race or gender. And too often subsets of these groups are entirely left out from the survey taking, right? Like non-binary people who may not wish to be discriminated against for their gender identity. So this is a really sensitive topic because it is a catch-22 in that we don't necessarily want these major corporations to know so much about us. We certainly, if they are going to know those things, want them to be protected with good security practices. But we also need to make sure that if we are going to collect all of this information, which is so useful in identifying traditionally underserved and underrepresented communities, that we do it in a way that is opt-in only, right? Like we can't just simply go around scraping all of these demographic labels. That would be worse than potentially the alternative. But the unfortunate fact is that in order for us to know if this technology is discriminating against single mothers, for instance, then we need to know that fact about at least a portion of the group in order to do our very tests.
Thank you.
So maybe
Did you have? Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll add something. So I definitely agree with the interventions that were mentioned, the policy interventions. And I'd say, like, I just want to kind of like highlight just the importance of legal frameworks and policy around this, especially now. And I think you can just look to my field, which is security and cryptography, as an example of what not to do. We built the internet and the whole tech infrastructure without enforcing privacy, without enforcing security, and it's been kind of a disaster, right? Like where we're at now because of this lack of enforcement, and we spent the last 30 years trying to fix that. And so I think with AI and machine learning technology, we really want to make sure to get ahead of it. I mean, it's already pretty late, but we still want to get in as early as possible with these frameworks so that 30 years from now we're not trying to figure out how to fix a problem that probably can't be fixed at that point.
The issue is that I can say what you just said, Senya. I can say that about when I see the computer vision field, it's so scary. You just go to the academic conference, just look at the big academic conference and all the tracks. It's like it might as well be surveillance, more surveillance with no safeguards, right? And so it always just ends up, the burden is too much on impacted communities to read all the agreements, to opt out, to understand, to fight the discrimination, and then to get retaliated against. Then you have academics who can do whatever they want, no burden. They don't have to show any show that it doesn't harm communities. Companies don't have to. And even if they do, then the punishment is so small that they're still incentivized to continue to do that, right? So the burden is just way too much on people from impacted communities. Because I see this next question about AI for good, that you can't have AI for good if people in impacted communities don't have time and are not invested in to then work on their vision of the future. I think that's the only time you can have AI for good.
Thank you all. And Tamia, thank you for setting us up for the next question. So AI for good in quotes is a phrase that is often used to describe the development and use of technologies to address society's most urgent issues, but for good and good for whom often goes undefined, as you mentioned. In contrast, we should have some shared understanding, or could have some shared understanding of democratic values like justice, common good, equality, diversity. Can each of you share and describe a feature of an AI technology or the AI design process that is required for AI to advance democratic values? And let's do the same where please unmute yourself and share thoughts. And please also feel free to respond to each other as well.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe just start by saying that this notion of AI for good is so often used in defense of technologies that are at their very core anti-democratic, right? Like my colleague Jack Polson is a big proponent of monitoring human rights groups who use the same technology to, find refugees, which is one thing, but then to surveil them on partnership with government agencies as well, with the same technology on the same budget. And it's really concerning when you see that kind of partnership grow. So when I think about AI for good, when AI is actually being used to do good and to advance democratic values, it's when it comes from grassroots people, groups of people who are then applying it on people who possess power. And so, for instance, instead of trying to debias a bail or recidivism algorithm, which is absolutely something that needs to happen, don't get me wrong, but instead of taking that approach, why don't we use this very powerful pattern recognizing technology to try to identify the judges who consistently discriminate in their judgments, in their verdicts and sentences. So I think that our ability to work together and to turn this powerful technology around and to use it to identify these bad actors is something that is absolutely, in the best possible case, like the definition of democratic AI.
Thanks, Liz. Anyone else?
So yeah, so I think there's two features in my mind that come to mind. One of them is security. So these machine learning models can be hacked, right? In the sense that it's possible to design inputs that fool them into making the wrong decision. And so the classical example that people give is if you have a self-driving car, but if I can put a sticker on a stop sign that can fool the self-driving car to recognize the stop sign as a speed limit sign, right? And so as machine learning models get deployed widely, more and more widely, they're going to become targets, right, for hackers, for nation states, et cetera. So security is one feature that is going to be important, right, as these technologies get deployed. The second feature that I think is also important is that sometimes AI is just not needed at all, right? Like we don't have to build AI systems for everything. And I think this is a problem that we have, in the tech community, is that we want to automate everything. That's our default solution to all, right? And but just because you can do something doesn't mean that you have to, right? Or doesn't mean that it's a good idea. So, learning how to discern which cases, when we should use AI, when there are actually positive outcomes, and when it's going to do more harm than good, is really important. Right.
Thanks, Sunny and Jen.
I can jump in here. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about the AI design process and incentives here. And I think this also relates to this point that just because we can do something doesn't mean that we should. So all across the tech industry, there's this real pressure to scale up quickly, right? If we have an AI system that works well in one region, in one language, whatever, how do we just take this and roll it out globally as quickly as possibly? as possible. And this is something that Timnit touched on earlier when she was talking about social media sites in Ethiopia. Okay. In a recent research study that I ran with some collaborators, we looked at how teams building AI systems go about planning disaggregated evaluations. So how they go about planning to evaluate systems broken down by different factors or demographic groups. And one thing that we observed over and over talking with people building these systems is this tension between building systems that do work well for everyone and this pressure to scale up as quickly as possible. There's a huge tension here, right? How can we build systems that work well for everyone when we're developing them using cultural context and needs and sometimes data from just one group without engaging with stakeholders in other contexts at all? This is also related to the portability trap that Sorel and others have discussed in their work. So I guess in terms of what features we need, I would say that work in responsible AI is just fundamentally really slow. It requires digging into a lot of different contexts, different domains, and really tailoring approaches to needs. That's how it's going to be if we want to do responsible AI. And if we need to, if we have this goal of AI that works for everyone, we're going to need to be willing to accept this slowdown.
So I totally agree with Jennifer in saying that we need to kind of balance those tensions of trying to do things at scale versus doing things the right way. And so I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of the AI design process, not necessarily the features. As a human-computer interaction researcher, I think first and foremost, we need to involve diverse stakeholders, like everybody said, early and throughout the entire design process. We can do this through using participatory design methods where end users are elevated to the level of co-designers of a system so that they can inform how a system should be built or even if it should be, because I really liked Sunny's point about we shouldn't always be technology evangelists. Sometimes technology just isn't the right answer. So as an example, in our lab, we do this by working directly with teens and sometimes parents to create novel design patterns to promote adolescent online safety, because teens should be stakeholders in their own online safety. So making sure that their input is translated into design of the systems that they use is a first step of making sure that AI systems are human-centered. Second, we also need to account for how AI systems are used in practice, not just in theory, because there are always going to be unintended consequences of use. So a system might be designed to do good, but we need to think about the ways in which it could go wrong. An approach for doing this would be to create speculative design fictions or these provocative scenarios around how a technology designed artifact could be used to start these meaningful and difficult conversations that ultimately result in better design. It's important to critically debate and constructively discuss these somewhat politically charged topics like democracy, AI, and what is good, because honestly, there's no single ground truth. So holding panels like this one can definitely help start those uncomfortable but necessary conversations. So I'm really glad that you invited us here today to talk about these topics.
I wanted to chime in on my idea of what good would be, or what the question. Sorry, I don't have to the actual question we're discussing. And I think it's like whatever all of you said, which is especially what Liz started with, which is something that gives that equalizes power in some way, something that gives power to the people who don't have it right now. And that's what democracy is supposed to be like too, right? You're supposed to have checks and balances. You're supposed to have different wings of government so that you can have discussions and not so that it's not an authoritarian rule where one group of people just do whatever they want all the time. That's what we're supposed to have. But we see it like with AI, with for example, large tech companies. The heads of large tech companies have an outsized say on everything right now. For example, I'll give some examples like Eric Schmidt, right? Lots of say at Google, lots of say in the government, lots of say through your foundation, so that even philanthropy, right? So that's an outside sort of say. And on the other hand, impacted communities don't. They are fighting everything that these companies are pushing out, and they don't have much of a say. They don't have the time. They don't have the megaphone, right? So any technology that changes that dynamic, to me, is good. But unfortunately, a lot of times, because I forgot who said AI is conservative, or because we're using past data. Somebody in the panel said that. Is it you, Liz? Okay, yeah. Because when you're dependent on that type of dynamic, then it's hard to make changes, right? You're always kind of preserving the status quo. And so when we see, for example, in social media, we see that, for instance, a lot of voices are stifled because they're harassed out of the platforms, and the dominant voice are the ones that stay. And then all of that is used as training data for like these I'm now talking about the paper that I wrote last year that I supposedly got fired for, but that's one of the things we talked about, is that how these models preserve the status quo. Because, for example, when we look at the training data that we use, and you look at the moderation platforms of social media, etc., a lot of voices are stifled because they're marginalized, they're harassed out, they're bullied out, they have death threats, and the issues that the accounts that issue the death threats are still around. They're not the ones that are bullied out. So you have this dynamic that is very, very different from AI for good, right? And so you have this data that's then encoded in all of the other things we're building. So for me, we cannot have AI for good without having the communities that are impacted. Good for who? Then the people we're trying to say it's good for them, they have to be at the forefront of creating this technology.
Thank you all for weighing in on your insights for AI for good. In about our last 10 minutes or so for Q&A, let's jump to a great question around human agency and data and representation, which I think comes up quite often. Thank you, Lillian Carrasquillo, for asking this from the general public. So how should we think about what agency humans have over the data representing them or us? Beyond data privacy, how can they inform what kinds of data is tracked or not, used in decisions or not, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think here an example is the European Union has GDPR, which I think tries to do this, right? It's an attempt at giving users more agency. So you have a right to access the data that a company has about you. You have the right to rectify that data. And you also have the right to be forgotten, right? So you can ask to be completely wiped out from the system. So that's one example.
I just want to add, though, even that, it's a great example. It puts the onus on us. There's too much of a burden. Like when I go, because of GDPR, I go to a website and I have to read, oh, you agree to this. I'm like, okay, the cookies, this. Okay, if I say no, I just can't use it. I just can't use the website. It's not like I have another option, right? So can we have an option where it doesn't put the onus so much on impacted communities and puts it on the people who are actually so I think the opt-in option, I think that Liz mentioned earlier, is a good one, where, well, if it's not just opting out, but I have unless I opt in, maybe that's one. I'm not sure, but I just feel like a lot of these things now have the onus on us.
I think that's a great point, but we also have to consider that trade-off, because one of the things we found in user experience research is there's this trade-off between privacy and personalization. So like when we give people more options and more choice, they don't like it because it can be overwhelming. And so how do we do that in like a meaningful way to get intelligent defaults that protect people by design rather than exploit them? I think that's a really great question to kind of think about when we're talking about agency. And I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head with talking about GDPR. Like in the US, we're far behind when it comes to privacy regulation. And we need to have those conversations to really think about how we can move forward. GDPR isn't a magic bullet, but it's at least an attempt, like you said, to go in the right direction. I'm in the state of Florida, which has these open laws called the Sunshine Laws. That's why the whole Florida Man experience exists, is because our arrest records are like public records, and so everybody can get them. So we're not crazier in Florida. It's just that our records are more public. So when I collect data from participants, I have to retain that data for 10 years, even if they withdraw from a study. And so when thinking about the laws and the regulations around privacy in the US, we really need to think about the idea of data retention, because this data is inevitably going to be used in some kind of algorithmic system.
You're entirely correct in so many ways. And I'd like to think about this notion of trade-offs for a moment, because I do think that at my core, I've been in tech for 10 years or so now, and I am a little bit of a techno optimist, or at least I used to be, before seeing a little bit of the maybe darker side of how these things actually work. And one of the problems that we deal with so often in artificial intelligence is the notion of data lineage. So that's a question of, where did you even get this data that you used to train an algorithm that is now being used to predict what school somebody should go to, for instance? And the answer to that question is often incredibly scary or unsavory. And we've seen this entangle itself within law enforcement all too many times. Just recently, several cases brought about the Muslim prayer app that was then selling data to law enforcement. And that's an incredibly common phenomenon. So I think people don't even realize that these moments where you are sacrificing your privacy in exchange for personalization, which I love personalization, by the way, it makes the internet usable in some ways. But at the same time, you're also setting people, and usually not the majority in class, right? Like the white cis straight people, but all of the other people who would suffer real and severe consequences just in order to have like a different color button on their homepage. So that disparity is something that really hit me in the last couple of years, that there are these invisible trade-offs that we too often don't see. And in the United States, a complete lack of laws that are in place to protect us from those kinds of abuses. So, it's for those of us who are designing technology, for those of us who are creating it and helping other companies make their technology safer and more inclusive, it's really important that we think deeper beyond just this notion of user KPIs, engagement, MAUs. All of these things are important, but what's more important is that we make sure that we maintain a functional democracy.
Thank you. Jen, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to all of this. I think everyone has answered this question extremely well already. I'll just echo that I think it's so important to have reasonable defaults, because the vast majority of people are not going to be changing the defaults. And I think we just also need more work on how to present choices to the public in a simple manner that people will be able to actually make sense of and understand, because we can give people choices, but if people don't understand how these different options are actually affecting them, what it actually means for their data to be used, what the benefits are and what the drawbacks are, then giving them choices is not actually that helpful.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left, which I think would be a great way to wrap up with one final question. And we can go through the same order in which you all went through initially, which means we'll start with you, Liz. So one final question is, in 1 minute each, what else about all of these issues do you think policymakers and the general members of the public need to know about? And we can wrap up from there.
Yeah, it's hard for me to say that there is even one thing, right? Because the reason that I came to these issues is due to 10 years of experience. I do think that people need to, regulators and the public do need to understand that people care about these issues, and they care about whether or not they have control over machines making decisions about their lives. And the only way we're going to find a good balance between industry and democracy is through consultation. So it's really exciting to be a part of this panel and all of the different RFIs and requests for feedback that we've been receiving through this administration. And I truly hope that it continues into the future.
Thank you. And over to you, Professor Wisniewski.
Yeah, so I think really the most important takeaway is that we need to build bridges and we need to work together, because we all speak different languages. We all have different backgrounds. And we need to make the field of computer science and the field of data science more accessible to the public. Because a lot of the tension that arises is because people don't quite understand how algorithms work or how decisions are being made. And without that level of transparency, then the people who are in the room are only the people who aren't the ones who are being affected by these algorithms. So really thinking about a way to make this a broader conversation of, teaching kids in high school how to write an algorithm and what an algorithm is and what it does and what it can't do. I think that's really important.
And you, Professor Camara.
Yeah, so I think we're in a different phase of technology's evolution. Before, technology was mainly used, right? Like algorithms were mainly designed to run machines, right? And then network of machines, clusters of machines, et cetera. We're in a fundamentally different phase now where algorithms are being designed and used to affect people, right? And that's completely different. And because of this, I think we really have to shift how we think of technology, how we design technology, and how we constrain technology. And I think it's very appropriate for there to be, stronger legal frameworks. I think we want the public more involved in the decision-making around algorithms and around technology as well. So I think we really need to rethink kind of like, or understand that we're in a fundamentally different phase of our evolution, with respect to technology. And we really need to have more guardrails than we did before.
Thank you. Dr. Kabir, over to you.
Echoing everything else, I would just say if it doesn't pass the smell test, it doesn't make any sense. So for the public, if it doesn't pass your smell test, AI is not magic. It's technology. So when people are just talking about something that doesn't sound real, it probably isn't. And there's so much hype right now. And so just be careful of the hype. We should kind of de-hype this space. And I would like to see a lot more investment in the disciplines that have been warning us about this for a long time: science and technology, studies, sociology, etc. We need interdisciplinary work, and that means they need to be invested on. So the next time you're investing $100 million on your computer science department, but no money for anybody else, like just think about, shifting some of that funding to the other departments.
Thank you. And over to you, Dr. Wortman-Bond.
Thanks. So, absolutely 100% yes on the less hype and on the investing in interdisciplinary studies as well. It's so important. I would also emphasize again that, this is just a very complicated space. There aren't any easy answers here. There are no simple metrics that are always appropriate. There aren't easy fixes. And I think we need right now to be focusing more on just the process of how people are building technology. How do we get people building the technology to be having the right conversations at the right times? How do we get them to be including the right stakeholders? How do we get them to be carefully thinking through whether they even should be building this technology in the first place and what potential harms could come from it? And just more generally, we need to figure out how we can take this process and get people who are, trained to move fast to just slow down and think more carefully about what they're doing.
Thank you for that wonderful wrap up. Thank you so much. And now back to you, Dr. Sorel Friedler, our Assistant Director for Data and Democracy at the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House, for closing remarks.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing your ideas and offering your expertise. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in from across the country to be part of this discussion. In the coming months, the administration will continue hosting engagements like this one with partners and experts across the federal government, in academia, civil society, the private sector, and communities all over the country. As we've heard from the panelists, technology can only work for everyone if everyone is included. So we want to hear from you. Before we close, let me again invite you to share your feedback with us on any of the issues we've discussed today by emailing your feedback to ai-equity@ostp.eop.gov. We're grateful to you for being with us and look forward to your continued engagement in the weeks and months ahead as we work together to create a Bill of Rights for our automated society. Thank you again to the panel and to all of you for participating in this process.